Hi, and welcome to the Journalism Salute. I'm Mark Simon. In each episode, we'll talk to or about an interesting person or organization related to journalism. The intent is to show that journalists are not the enemy of the people. Thank you for listening. On this episode, we're joined by CJ Janovy. CJ is the director of content for KCUR, the NPR affiliate in Kansas City, Missouri. She has previously worked as editor of The Pitch, Kansas City's alt weekly, and as an editor at Kansas Reflector, a nonprofit covering state government in Kansas. She's also the author of No Place Like Home: Lessons in Activism from LGBT Kansas. It's a book she describes as a love story, and there's a documentary that serves as a sequel to the book, directed by Kevin Wilmot, who directed Black Klansman. Hi, CJ. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Mark. Thanks so much for having me.
So, yours is a long, storied career. What's your origin story?
I was trying to remember my origin story. I think that, I somehow ended up as editor of my high school paper. And that's when I realized, that I could get a lot of positive attention for writing things that people read. And I think I enjoyed that as a young teenager. And there have been periods of time in my life when I've tried to get out of journalism, but I keep ending up back in it.
Is there anything in your upbringing or heritage that would lend itself to telling stories with the knowledge that your father is a writer?
My father is a writer, and I have two siblings, and one of them is a journalist as well. And I honestly don't know. My parents did not, push us into one career or another. Um, they really allowed us to find our own passions and our own way in life. But I do remember, my mom tells this story of me just being really verbose as a young child, and also having a strong sense of justice, is how she puts it. And so I think those two factors probably combined for a career path in journalism.
When I was looking back at your clips, I saw that they could go back upwards of 30 years, and I saw profiles of Melissa Etheridge. I saw profiles of filmmakers and artists from that time. The people, and I saw more recently, the people preserving the memory of the creator of the Pride flag. Can you summarize some of the highlights of your career up to this point in terms of how they shaped you into who you are?
Well, as you note, it's been a long time. I think, just for context of those stories that you mentioned, I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska. I went to a couple years of journalism school at the University of Nebraska, and then I transferred out to California and finished school in the Bay Area, and then I went to grad school at Boston University. And by that point, I wanted to be a novelist, but my workshop, creative writing workshop, convinced me that I was not a fiction writer, and that I had maybe more useful talents as an editor. And I ended up in Kansas City. Basically, it was going to be a pit stop on the way back to California. And this is where I ended up building a career over 30 years. So those early stories, like it very quickly, I found a job with the alternative paper here. In those days, it came out every 2 weeks, and it eventually became the classic alt weekly. But it was the early 90s. It was sort of the glory days of alternative newspapers. And Melissa Etheridge, for example, grew up nearby, and she was on her way to becoming a big star by then. But certainly it was fair game to interview her and ask her about her Kansas upbringing when she came to town. And the profile of the Pride flag creator is much later. That's from just the last few years. And this is a that's a long and sort of sad story. Gilbert Baker grew up in a small town in the southeast corner of the state, and sort of got out as soon as he could, and went to San Francisco, and went on to create this iconic image that is understood the world over. And for a long time, he never wanted to come back to Kansas. But over the last decade or so, his high school friends remembered or realized what a contribution he had made, and they began inviting him back, and he was set to come back for their 50th high school reunion, and he died shortly before that. So, those are a little bit of, bookend stories that you noticed, I guess, that show Kansas having perhaps a larger influence on American culture than it may get credit for.
Is that kind of the theme of the time that you spent at the pitch?
The time that I spent at the pitch was more, like I said earlier, the glory days of the Alt Weekly, and for folks who remember that format of journalism, it was such a fun time. You know, we were, and the sort of business model is really important because the internet sort of killed the Alt Weekly. There are still many around, but it's definitely not the glory days. But there was, the back third of the paper was classifieds and personals, and the front of the paper, the cover story was, some in-depth feature or investigation or something. And so you could write really long, in-depth pieces. You had food reviews and music reviews, and you had a lot of personality. We didn't care about, language. We cared about really good writing, but we did not care about using profanity when it was warranted. And I have to say, Mark, the most fun thing about those days was every Wednesday the paper would get delivered all over town. And this was before cell phones. So you would go to your local bar or your restaurant down the street on a Wednesday evening, and there'd be a tall stack of pitches in the news rack, and everybody would be excited to see it, and they would pick it up and they would read it while they were standing in line waiting for their order, or they would sit down in a booth and they would look at the front page, and it would be good art, and then they would flip it over and read it from the back to the front, because what everybody cared about the most were those personals. And we also ran Dan Savage's sex advice column, so I knew that was going to happen, and it did unfailingly. That's how humans behaved with the weekly paper.
I remember it with the Village Voice, certainly.
Right.
So yeah, I'm I'm a little red in the face, but I do.
You're totally busted.
Yeah, I do remember.
Yeah.
All right. So fast forwarding to now, what do you
Yeah.
do at KCUR, and how do you shape the vision of the station and its content?
Well, as you mentioned, KCUR is an NPR affiliate in Kansas City. It's a pretty big newsroom, and so we have about 30 reporters, editors, and producers actually in the newsroom. But KCUR is also headquarters for 3 regional reporting collaborations. So we have something called the Kansas News Service, which is actually 4 public radio stations that provide news to all of Kansas. We're home to Harvest Public Media, which is a 6-state collaboration covering rural issues and agriculture in the region. And then we're also home to NPR's Midwest Newsroom, which is public media outlets in 4 states, and they do investigative reporting. So this idea of collaborative news projects, KCR has been a leader in that over the years, and so we have a very wide reach in the region and nationally because of those other elements of our newsroom. So my job there is to really make sure all those 4 newsrooms are humming. I like to explain my job as meeting all day with really great journalists and telling them yes or be careful. It's a little bit of a boring bureaucratic job in that way, but I've got a really talented group of editors and reporters who are, doing day turn stories for our audio newscasts. But a lot of people don't realize that we also have a very robust website with all sorts of digital content that people don't get if they're only listening to the radio.
So can you give us an example of what you did yesterday or today or any
I don't
particular
want to
day?
talk about yesterday.
Okay.
I was I was literally on Zoom meetings the entire day.
All right, so
And
pick a good day
so,
that gives us a good example of a day in the life of the job.
I mean, when this is not going to be thrilling, I don't think, but folks who know newsrooms know that the upper management folks do spend a lot of time in meetings. And so that even on a good day, a big chunk of my day will be meetings, but they'll be fun meetings talking with the people who are actually working on stories, considering stories, mapping them out, scheduling them, bringing problems to me, whether it's a resource problem of how to allocate reporters' time, or where to go for perspective. I have been in Kansas City long enough to know that, for example, during our editors meeting this morning, for example, there was a conversation about it's getting ready to be summer. We have a pretty high homicide rate in Kansas City. It's going to be violent. We know that. We know that summer it gets more violent, and it's supposed to be an extra hot summer. And so, what our editor had been in conversations with her reporter, and what we were all talking about was there's really nothing for young people to do in Kansas City at night when school is out. And both of the editor and the reporter who are working on this have not lived in Kansas City for decades. And so they didn't have the perspective that this is a decades long problem in Kansas City. Whenever there's a particularly violent summer, then City Hall comes out with like a night hoops program or something. And these problems have never been solved by, by the government entities in town. And so, as sort of an elder at this point, who's worked in newsrooms for decades in this town, it was my job to say, let's approach that from a historical perspective.
Right, as opposed to something that's just in the now.
Right.
So on Sunday, it was a Sunday, either this past Sunday or the previous Sunday, I was looking at the front page of KCUR, and I see considerable diverse representation. There was a story about Kansas City and the LGBTQ community building support. There's a story about an Asian American Pacific Island festival. There's one about Cori Bush introducing a reparations bill, and then another about the end of the Attorney General's trans healthcare ban in Missouri. As content director, what tone do you want to set with the coverage that's on the website?
Well, I want to reflect our community. And Kansas City is a city of about 2 million people, sprawling Midwestern industrial metropolis that's really pretty diverse. And so you see that in a lot of the stories, I hope, every day when you look at the website. Those stories that you mention, part of part of what's really great about our newsroom, in addition to those NPR collaborations that I mentioned earlier, we also collaborate with a lot of other nonprofit news outlets in Kansas City. We have a content sharing arrangement, and so some of those stories came from our other media partners. The story of Cori Bush. Cori Bush represents St. Louis, which is across the state from us, but St. Louis demographically is not unlike Kansas City, and certainly she's a figure of interest on this side of the state line. So, I think we're, and the trans stories that you mentioned, Kansas City is not unique because state legislatures here have been passing a lot of the same bills that have passed elsewhere in the country. Kansas City is unusual though, because the city straddles the state line between Missouri and Kansas. And so we're keeping an eye on the Missouri State House in Jefferson City, where a lot of anti-trans legislation is happening. And we're keeping an eye on the Kansas State Capitol in Topeka, where same deal. So there's maybe been double the coverage of that legislation over this past session.
What makes Missouri particularly distinct, appealing, and challenging to cover?
Missouri is particularly appealing, distinct, and challenging to cover because I think in a lot of ways it's a microcosm of the whole country. So, Kansas City straddling the state line could be like the West Coast, and St. Louis also really is right on the edge of Missouri and Illinois, so that could be the East Coast. And those are pretty, liberal places, very diverse places. And most of the middle of the state is much more conservative and less demographically diverse. There's a sort of college town in the middle, but the state itself is also much more economically diverse than it might be stereotyped to be. And there's it's the I think industry, it's not straight agriculture. The Ozarks is right in the middle of it, so tourism is a pretty big industry in Missouri. And so, but politically it's changed dramatically in the last decade. It used to be, as recently as 10 years ago, it was considered a political swing state, and now it is hard right. And Kansas has a similar but also different set of interesting circumstances. It is primarily agricultural. It has a pride of being a free state. So, living on a border, you hear a lot, Missouri was a slave state, Kansas was a free state. And I think one sees those tensions still today in a lot of the culture war stuff that happens.
Wow. Is there some coverage that the station has done recently that you're particularly proud of?
We won an award from investigative reporters and editors for a podcast that we did called Overlooked, which traces the decades of police corruption in Kansas City, Kansas, which is the sort of, people might not know, there's Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas. Kansas City, Kansas is the much poorer and much less white city.
The podcast series focused on the accusations against a Kansas City police detective who was alleged to have committed kidnappings and sexual assaults against local black women. The podcast covers the story in great detail and prominently centers the women accusing the officer, who is under federal indictment and has pled not guilty. And your role, what was your role in this?
I was the editor on that podcast, and so Peggy was a reporter along with two reporters, Steve Vachrot and Dan Margulies. And then we had this phenomenal team of producers, two producers, primarily Suzanne Hogan and Mackenzie Martin of the podcast production wing at KCUR. So, and lots of other folks involved along the way, but that was the main team.
So I want to segue to your book. You wrote a book, Lessons in Activism from LGBT Kansas, a personal story to cover for you as a member of that community. I watched an hour-long talk that you gave where you talked about the different people that you met for this book to the Kansas Historical Society. There was a woman having a conversation in the car with her grandfather while listening to Melissa Etheridge, a couple that got married, meeting people who surprised them with the way that they were welcomed in a friendly way. There was the transgender woman who would stop people, talk to them, and then ask them if they knew anyone who was trans. And when they said no, she would reveal that she was one. Those are examples of some of the things that are spotlighted in your book. What was the experience of making the book and then make the subsequent making of the movie like?
We got hours of tape in filming the movie, so I won't try to convey all of it on this podcast. But I imagine many of your listeners will remember the 2015 Supreme Court decision that legalized same-sex marriage all across the country. Hopefully a few of them will also remember the mid-2000s, where gay marriage was a super political issue, and many states around the country passed state constitutional amendments banning same-sex marriage. So that all happened in around 2004. and voters were very, those constitutional amendments passed by 70 and 80%. So that's the percent of the voting population that was against same-sex marriage. 10 years later, by the time the Supreme Court legalized it, most people were, the majority of Americans were in favor of same-sex marriage. And so as a journalist, I was watching this change in public opinion happen over that period of a decade. And I knew that it was a really interesting story. And I knew that people in rural places had worked very hard to be open and honest about their lives with their loved ones, with their neighbors, with their coworkers. And that had involved a lot of the time, you know, political efforts like going to City Hall and asking your city commission to add non-discrimination ordinances so you would be protected from discrimination. And a lot of times these were very controversial issues in a town of 50,000 people in Kansas. That this stirred things up for a long time. But in the course of doing that work, a lot of people came out, a lot of people built community, a lot of people discovered that they had friends and allies that they didn't know about. And that's part of what led to the change in public opinion. And so I just sort of saw an epic yarn with some really interesting people who would make good characters. And that's why I set out to write that book. I just thought it was a great untold story. When people think about gay rights, LGBTQ rights in America, they think about places like San Francisco and New York City and LA and DC. But, LGBTQ people are everywhere, and Kansas makes a really good place Kansas is a really rich place to tell that story for two reasons. It was headquarters to the Westboro Baptist Church, which some people might know as the small group of people who have made their brand is to go around at public events, most frequently funerals, and hold up really offensive signs that say things like "God hates fags." They are headquartered in Topeka, Kansas. But the other reason why Kansas is a great place to tell stories is because everyone in the world thinks they know Kansas because of, the Wizard of Oz. And so there are Judy Garland type themes and other
Title of the book.
Other elements of the book that have particular resonance in the LGBTQ community as well.
What is the experience of the writing part of that like for you?
Just a lot of work. The fun part was driving all over the state to different towns and farms and really tiny rural areas and meeting people. And people were so generous with their stories. And a lot of these stories were hard for people. People had experienced painful things and they didn't really enjoy telling me their stories, but they all said, I'm telling you my story because I hope no one else has to go through what I went through. And so then that I felt a really strong sense of responsibility to get it right when people had entrusted me in that way. And, then I did have a day job at the time. So I spent mornings and weekends working on it.
It's also, you mentioned your creative writing background and the way that, especially as you told the stories in the talk that I saw, there was a lot of character to those people. And you could see that was it was rich territory for someone who likes to write creatively, as I presume you do.
Well, that's one of the things that made it so satisfying and just gave me so much momentum.
Sure. So you wrote a blog as well that helped promote the book online. There was one item in there that was interesting, the idea that not every Kansas Republican leader hates the LGBTQ community was one item. And I'm curious, with that in mind, how have you seen Kansas progress and regress since your book came out?
Right after my book came out, there was sort of a burst of progress. In 2018, Kansans elected a lesbian Native American woman named Sharice Davids. They sent her to Congress, and they sent two openly gay representatives to the Kansas House of Representatives. And in a in the city's main population centers, there was a wave of city councils that passed non-discrimination ordinances. And I think this all was the result of increased activism on the part of communities in response to the 2016 election of Donald Trump. And that, I think, what people told me at that time was that election had really awakened them. And I think we saw that all over the country. People suddenly taking an interest in politics. And, that was a very, that wave of activism that led to a lot of progress for LGBTQ people was met with the severe backlash that we're seeing in state legislatures now.
So specific to the journalism that you see as it's covering this story in 2023, and you said the severe backlash, what do reporters and editors do well when it comes to covering anti-LGBT legislation and activism, and where could they use some guidance?
I think that, first of all, for every working reporter out there who's trying to get this stuff right, congratulations for staying in journalism and covering these hard issues. I mean, it's the most stressful time to be a journalist that I've ever seen in the long decades that I've been doing it. So it's not easy to say, you should be doing a better job when you're just trying to get stuff covered. And when especially I know what it's like to cover a state house, and it's exhausting and all consuming. But I do think that the media in general has failed Americans by not doing a better job of state house coverage. And I don't mean this as any disrespect to the state house reporters who are out there working. I think they're doing as good a job they can, but I don't think, I think that with shrinking newsrooms and with the general public not inclined really to care about state politics anyway. I mean, this is what I found in my reporting is, people know who the president is. They probably know who their senator is. They probably know who their mayor is. But all the elected officials in between that, they know less and less, and they care less and less. And this is especially true with state representatives and state senators. I actually did a person on the street column about this where I literally went around and asked people about their state rep, and they had no idea who it was. And so it's really easy for state legislatures not to be held accountable, as a general rule, because people just aren't paying attention. And so then when you have really sort of high decibel, high volume culture war type of activities going on in a state legislature, number one, it distracts the public and the media from other things that are happening in that legislature. So that's one thing that I think we need to do better at, is not be so susceptible to the loudest voices in the room. And the other thing I think we need to do is to make state government coverage more readable, more understandable, and more relevant to average people. And so I think that means you have to sit through a lot of really boring committee hearings to get the nugget of activity that actually matters to a lot of people in their day-to-day life. And I think we're really bad at that.
For your career, 30 plus years of journalistic experience, how has being a journalist impacted how you view the world?
Well, it's depressing on the one hand, but it's also, it's a privilege. This job is a real privilege. And like I said earlier about people entrusting you with their stories and their lives is, I feel, is a sacred responsibility. And so even in the most depressing times, I know that I'm hopefully doing something that helps somebody somewhere.
We haven't really talked about how you handle being a journalist, but I've been asking all of the different people that we've had on, how do you manage your mental health as it relates to the job?
I I'm pretty good at compartmentalizing, and I think that might not be healthy by therapeutic standards, but I think the journalists who are able to separate themselves and their hearts from the hard news that they have to be covering, those of us who can do that probably are less affected. But I think all of us at this point, everyone in my newsroom, myself included, we are either taking extra measures to take care of ourselves or thinking that we probably should.
I have two questions left. One is our advice question. Pick an area in which you feel you're qualified to give advice to aspiring journalists, and what advice would that be?
I think if I could give two pieces of advice, one would be just figure out better state government coverage, and
Okay.
and and in doing that, I maybe should have made this point earlier, but don't look just at the end result of who's voting for what bill and what this bill does. Trace the bill all the way back to its origins, where it came from, who's giving money to what candidates and why. Follow that money all the way back to the source of whatever you're reporting on. That would be my sort of industry advice to journalists of all ages. And to younger, you did ask about younger. Yeah. So I
Sure.
would just say, man, just stay strong. This is a tough job. This is a hard job. And if it's too painful, then there are other ways to be of use to society. But if you're gonna stay in journalism, you got to be tough.
Got to be tough.
Yeah.
The show is called the Journalism Salute because we're saluting you for your good work, and we ask that you do likewise. We've touched on a few topics here, LGBT coverage and state house coverage in particular. Is there a journalist or journalism organization, maybe from one or both of those groups, that you would like to salute for their good work?
Well, I think I've already tried to salute all working journalists, and I want to, especially shout out to those state house reporters. But when I think about one journalist who's made the most impact, in my recent memory, it's Nicole Hannah-Jones with the 1619 Project, and I just think, her work made me see the world in a different way, and certainly sparked crucial conversations.
And then 1619 Project has a documentary on coming out as
Yeah.
well on Hulu.
Yeah. Yes, can I say one? Can I add one more journalist?
Go ahead.
Randy Schiltz, the famed San Francisco Chronicle reporter who wrote "And the Band Played On" and "Conduct Unbecoming" and the biography of Harvey Milk, and died of AIDS. I don't remember what year, but in the early 80s, Randy Schiltz chronicled the most momentous developments, some in America. I'm not just going to say for the LGBTQ community, but really for America, and died way too young. And I often wonder what he would be writing about if he were still working.
Well, CJ Janovy, thank you for taking the time to join us. Best of luck with your work and your future projects.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor.
Thank you for listening to the Journalism Salute. Please let us know what you think of the show. You can find us on Twitter at JournalismPod, and you can email us at journalismsalute@gmail.com.